Uh, we're discussing Sudan because it's in the grip of a military coup, as Mohammed has already said, led by General Abdel Fattah Burhan. And that's a coup that's removed the civilian part of the supposed power sharing government between the military and the civilian government, and is currently rounding up hundreds of activists on the ground, including trade unionists, including protesters and protest leaders. And it should be absolutely clear that we oppose the coup and we stand in solidarity with the resistance in Sudan. I think it's also very important to say, though, that we see the coup as not just a horrible event in isolation, but a coup that's designed to bring to an end a revolutionary process. And not just bring to an end a revolutionary process, but as Mohammed has already alluded to reverse all the gains of the revolution, to undo all the work of the revolution, and to ensure that the people in Sudan never again rise up in revolution. This is the aim of the coup that's taking place in Sudan. And it's important to say that because a couple of years ago in 2019, when we saw around the world a range of massive explosions of anger which swept through Chile, Ecuador, Lebanon, Haiti, Hong Kong, Algeria, and so on, Sudan was part of that process. And I would say that Sudan was the highest peak in that process because it was a genuine revolutionary explosion, not just an uprising, but a revolution in Sudan. And what I mean by revolution in this context is that in 2019, the masses took to the streets, they confronted the Sudanese state, and they sought to take history into their own hands and reshape the destiny of that country. That's what we mean by a revolutionary process. Now, to put this in context, there have been revolutions, many revolutions through recent centuries. Revolutions come in two varieties, very crudely. On the one hand, you have what I would call political revolutions. And political revolutions are processes that involve the masses taking to the streets and removing one set of political leaders and replacing them with another set through a revolutionary process. This is what happened in 2019 in Algeria. It's what happened in 2011 in the Arab Spring in Egypt, in Tunisia, and there are many other examples through the 20th and 21st century that we could look at of these kind of political revolutions. Then there are much rarer events which are called social revolutions. And what we mean by social revolutions is not just a revolution that changes the people at the top of society, the political leaders, but a revolution that heralds a transformation of the entire social structure, that marks a transformation from one kind of society to another. If we look at some historical examples, the Great French Revolution of 1789 was an example of this. It broke the power of feudalism and began to create the conditions for the development of capitalism in France in 1789. If we look at the Russian Revolution in 1917, it broke the power of capital along with the feudal landowners of Russia and began the process of moving towards a socialist society in Russia based on the democratic rule of workers. Now, the 1917 revolution was not ultimately able to affect that transition. Under Stalin, that process was completely reversed, but the Russian Revolution showed the possibility of workers leading a revolution that broke with capitalism. And what kind of revolution was Sudan in 2019? Sudan in 2019 was a revolution of the first kind. It was a political revolution. But it was what the American Marxist Hal Draper calls a political revolution with a social soul. Yes, it brought about a political change at the top of society, but it evoked a mass movement from below that posed much deeper questions about what would happen in Sudan, about how deep the revolutionary process could go, and about the possibility of social revolution, about the possibility of wider social change. And what I want to argue in this talk is it's that possibility of a deeper social revolution, a socialist revolution, that offers the best protection against the coup makers in Sudan, and against their co-thinkers around the world, who Mohammed has already talked about, who support the coup that's taking place in Sudan. So let me talk a little bit about what happened in 2019, in the run-up to 2019. If you want to look at the Sudanese Revolution, it begins in late 2018, and it begins, as almost any revolution in history begins, it begins with a crisis. And a crisis in which, as Lenin put it, talking about the Russian Revolution, the two Russian revolutions in the early 20th century, a crisis in which the rulers can no longer rule in the old way, and the ruled are no longer prepared to be ruled in the old way. If you look at Sudan in 2018, when the uprising really begins, it was a society in a very deep crisis for complicated reasons to do with the politics and geographical structure and the economics of Sudan plunging into crisis. The ruling class begins to fracture. There's all kinds of problems at the top of society. But in the context of this, there's an attempt to raise food prices by stripping away subsidies and imposing austerity, essentially making the Sudanese people pay for the crisis. In 2018, the price of bread triples in Sudan, and there begins this mass spontaneous uprising protest from below. And it's part of the dynamic of revolution that as these processes begin to emerge from below, the cracks at the top of society begin to widen. And the more the cracks at the top of society widen, the more inspiration is given to the movement from below. People think they're winning stuff, they're transforming society, and they fight harder. And it's in this context that the regime begins to crack apart. The revolutionary process goes on from calling for affordable food and bread and so on, to calling for the resignation of Omar al-Bashir, who's ruled the country at this time for more than 3 decades. And this mass spontaneous rebellion grows, the anger deepens, and the divisions grow at the top. In this case, the protest movement takes the form both of a growing wave of protests and sit-in, sit-down protests and so on, but also crucially a series of strikes and attempts to organize general strikes based within the Sudanese working class, bringing workers and workers' struggle into the picture. That's something I'm going to say more about in a moment. But revolutions are also, it's very important to say, a festival of the oppressed. So if you look at the most striking images of 2019 in Sudan, one of the things that you see in the images that are broadcast or photographed from Sudan is women, one of the most oppressed groups in most societies, and certainly in Sudanese society, at the forefront of this revolution, making speeches, leading the protests, and so on and so forth. So this revolution that begins as a spontaneous rebellion also evokes the possibility of liberation for numerous different oppressed groups. And as the strike movement, these demonstrations unfold, there's a huge sit-in that takes place outside the army headquarters in Khartoum, the capital. And it's here that you start to get the military high command recognizing that Omar al-Bashir, the person who's ruled Sudan, is now a liability. And so in 2019, in April 2019, the army step in, they remove Bashir in order to try to preserve the old order. And this is the first massive victory of the revolution. But what this does, like in many revolutions, is the moment you start to get the regime on the back foot, it gives more confidence to the revolution from below. The revolutionary process deepens because people say, if we can topple Omar al-Bashir, he's been in power for 30 years, what else can we achieve? There's a very powerful 2-day general strike that takes place in May 2019. And at this point, the army moved towards repression. and this is something that Mohammed has already spoken about, there's an extraordinarily brutal massacre in early June. Hundreds of people are killed, others are brutalized, there are rapes of women and so on, in order to end the sit-down protests outside the army headquarters, in order to break the revolutionary process. But still the protests continue, and the old mechanism of repression begins to falter. There's more general strikes, more protests. And this process really continues until mid-August in 2019. And that's when you get the institution of the transitional government between the army and the civilians, the civilian component of which has just been overthrown in the coup. The formation of this government, of course, is a victory for the movement, but in some ways it's a relatively limited victory. The opposition had agreed to a deal that didn't bring about fundamental change, and nor even a fully civilian government, but involved power sharing with the military. And there's a huge danger to this that I'll come back to, but there's a very famous saying of for a previous revolution, that those who half make a revolution dig their own grave. But you see very clearly in Sudan that the problems of half making a revolution, and we're seeing that now in the coup attempt that's taking place. Because what happens is the military use that period of power sharing to restore their authority, to restore the chain of command, to prepare for the time when they can overthrow their civilian colleagues. And the period of transitional government rule is a period of demobilization of the mass movement of 2019. The movement doesn't survive into 2020 in the same fashion, and it creates the condition in which the army can try to come back. And what I want to do for the rest of the meeting is look at the lessons we can learn from this about revolutionary processes in general. Because I mentioned earlier that revolutions begin as spontaneous explosions of anger, but no revolution in history has ended spontaneously. Revolutions end when one side or the other consciously imposes itself over society. And in this process, different political forces will try to shape the trajectory of that revolution. And I want to argue that there are two fundamental problems that revolutions face. The first is what I would call the limitation of reformist politics. And the second is the problem of the state. So let me deal with those in turn. So the first problem, what do I mean when I talk about the problem of reformism? Revolutions, of course, begin often with demands for reform, asking for the price of bread to be lowered, or even asking for one of your rulers to be removed is at one level a demand for reform. It's not a demand for the overthrow of the entire social and political order. But when these revolutionary processes reach their high point, it poses in particularly sharp form the question of whether such a break with the existing order, a break with capitalism, really is what we're talking about, is possible, or whether the limits of this revolutionary moment and movement will be set by what's achievable within the framework of the capitalist system. That's the choice between a fundamentally revolutionary break and a process of reform. And as these revolutionary processes emerge, people engage in a learning process. Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, put it very well when he said that, revolutions learn for a process of successive approximation. They test out the leaders who are thrown up in one period, they find their limitations, and they move on to the next set of politics, often a more radical and deeper politics. So it's a learning process. But it's not a learning process that can continue indefinitely over 50 or 100 years. It's compressed in time. And so the different political forces shaping this process are tremendously important. And here you get a range of different forces coming to the fore in Sudan. The political forces involved are actually very diverse. If you look at the Forces for Freedom and Change, the main sort of opposition coalition, it's extraordinarily diverse. It contains elements drawn from the Sudanese Professionals Association, which is the main body that organized the radical strike movements, the sit-ins and so on in Sudan, that organizes doctors and lecturers and teachers, but it played a much bigger role in coordinating the protest movement. But it also contains elements linked to the old elite in Sudan. It also contains sort of mainstream political parties from the opposition. It also contains various activist networks with their own particular political orientation. It's a amalgam of different political forces, some of whom are still quite wedded to the old political and social order in Sudan. So it's a contradictory force. And what you get in the revolutionary process is the old argument between reform and revolution returning, particularly in late summer and autumn in 2019, where the more moderate elements, what they do is they try and seek to channel the energy of the mass movement into securing a very, very limited deal with the army for this power sharing agreement. And I think it's important to say that this formation of a power sharing government has led to intense frustration from below. If you look at what that government has done, yes, there have been positive things like there was an inquiry into the massacre that took place, into the wealth of Omar al-Bashir and so on. That's now being torn apart by the coup. But if you look at the other things that they did, they signed a deal with the International Monetary Fund for debt relief. Now we know what a deal with the IMF means. It means that you have to cut state expenditure. It means you have to cut subsidies. It means a series of policies that saw inflation reach something like 400%, that took food again out of the reach of ordinary people. It meant opening up diplomatic relationships with Israel under US pressure in order to get support from the US and elsewhere. It means all kinds of compromises with the old order and the army. And this attempt to work with the military has been catastrophic politically. And it brings me to the second point I want to make about the dangers of the state. And here there is a fundamental truth that we have to recognize about revolutions, which is that the capitalist state in any society on the planet is very far from neutral. If you look at the role of the state in these kind of societies, in any modern society, anywhere in the world, the state is a body that arises in class societies to protect the interests of the powerful. That's the role it plays in Britain, in America, but also in Sudan, in Algeria, in any other country you care to look at. That's any other capitalist society, and every society on the planet is run along capitalist lines today. Under capitalism, the state evolves into a highly centralized body built around hierarchical institutions like the army, the police, the judiciary, the civil servants, and so on. Even in a parliamentary democracy like Britain, you have these hierarchical, unelected bodies at the core of the state, even more so in Sudan, which is very far from being a parliamentary democracy. And in any capitalist society, climbing to the pinnacle of these state institutions means proving your loyalty and reliability to the broader capitalist ruling class in those societies. You have to serve their interest to ascend to the top of the state machinery. So, even though at the lowest ranks of the state machinery, at the lowest ranks of the civil service, and critically at the lowest ranks of the army, you're talking about people drawn from the working class or drawn from the peasantry and small farmers and so on. But the top of these institutions, you have people who merge into the wealthy, powerful elite in this country. And that's why restoring the chain of command in a revolutionary process is so important. Yeah, 5 minutes left, thank you. In Sudan, which is very far from being a parliamentary democracy, the army is not just a powerful centralized institution, but it also has extraordinarily powerful economic muscle in that country. It controls large sections of the economy. It has vast political, economic, and social resources. it is in no sense a friend or an ally of the movement, and nor can it ever be. And here the most notorious figure in the state is, who's already been mentioned, is Hemeti, the man who leads the Rapid Support Forces, someone who built up the Rapid Support Forces as a sort of semi-militia that occasionally the Sudanese government has hired out to other repressive regimes in Yemen and elsewhere in the Gulf and so on. But it's essentially a thuggish militia run by Hemeti that was forged in the conflict in Darfur, where it was used to ethnically cleanse sections of the population, to brutally massacre people and so on. And it's Hemeti who oversaw the massacre that took place in 2019 during the coup attempt. And he is probably the most powerful figure in the Sudanese elite. He's someone who has enough personal wealth that in the transition to the transitional government, he used $1 billion of his own personal money to prop up the Sudanese central bank. This is the kind of person we're talking about, a constellation of economic, political, and military power. And it's completely naive to think any arrangement with figures like Hemeti will respect the civilian rule in Sudan. It's like, as the saying goes, trying to skin a tiger claw by claw. Tigers are in the business of skinning people much more than we are. And the tiger always wins that conflict. So in a revolutionary situation, the goal has to be to confront and break this repressive centralized force and replace it with new organs of rule from below. And I want to finish by just saying for a few minutes a little bit about what that could look like in Sudan. Because there is a counterpower in Sudan. There is a force that can bring about change. If you look at the revolution, I've already alluded to it, and there's a brilliant article by Anne Alexander in the ISJ, which I think Martin was going to post the link in the chat to. But she talks about the way that in the movement in 2019, you see glimpses of workers' power. The movement is carried forwards by mass strike movements in industry, in the public sector, and so on. And combined with this, you get glimpses of workers' democracy from below. You see it in particular in the neighborhood committees, the so-called resistance committees that form in 2019, that try to keep the army out of particular neighborhoods. And as they do so, they begin to take on some of the institutions of the state, of feeding people, of protecting people, of providing healthcare for people, and so on. It's these kind of networks from below that can democratically pose an alternative to the order that exists. Now, that didn't happen in 2019. It didn't cohere into an alternative form of workers' government, but it shows the potential for that. In order for it to crystallize into becoming that alternative, you need one other thing in society. You need a political force based within these revolutionary resistance committees, based inside the workers' movement, that can cohere this movement into a challenge to this enormously centralized state machinery. In other words, unless you have some kind of revolutionary political force, a revolutionary party in that society, you don't have the political instrument you need to pull the movement together and direct it against this extraordinary, powerful, centralized state machinery. And I think this is the challenge that's posed by revolution. And I want to just finish by talking about where we are now in Sudan, and just echoing and maybe developing some of Mohammed's points, if I may. I'll just be three minutes, if that's okay, Chair. The coup that's taken place is a terrible thing, as I've said, but I think it's important to say it has not yet succeeded in crushing the revolution. It's actually driven an incredible new wave of resistance. In late October, there were at 1.4 million people on the streets of Sudan in 30 different cities. Strikes have shut down the transport network, the public sector, the oil fields, sections of finance, and so on. What the coup must have revealed to ordinary people is the impossibility of coexisting with the military and the need for more fundamental change. And I think that's the real hope here. The military too have been scared by the scale of resistance. They will try, first of all, to crush the revolution. If they can't crush the revolution, they will look to strike some sort of new deal with sections of the opposition. We have to resist such a deal. But it's the kind of deal that has been promoted by the US, by its allies, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, and so on, which preserves intact the economic power and political power of the elite. We should say that the best prospect for the revolution is to reject such a deal and to push on for a deeper revolutionary change in which workers increasingly shape the direction of the revolution, and in which the question is posed not simply of the change of a few people at the top of society, but the creation of a new kind of society built around democratic workers' control. In other words, a socialist transition in Sudan and in the broader region within which Sudan sits is the best hope of securing genuine revolutionary change in the region. Our job is, of course, to build solidarity, to take inspiration from the struggles, but also to learn about the dynamics and lessons of revolution, and in particular, the crucial importance of forging mass revolutionary parties in whatever country you're in, if you want to see these kind of processes led to victory. So I'll finish there.